I let my cheating wife's lover think he was getting a wealthy widow until he realized I'd divorced her first. The whole thing started when I came home early from what was supposed to be a weekend business trip and found my wife in our bedroom with someone I'd never seen before. The guy was probably 10 years younger than me, wearing expensive clothes that screamed trust fund baby, and he had this smug look on his face like he owned the place. My wife just stared at me with this deer-in-headlights expression, clutching our Egyptian cotton sheets against her chest like they could somehow protect her from what was about to happen. Instead of losing my mind like most people would expect, something cold and calculating clicked inside my brain. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, taking in every detail of the scene, then calmly told them both to get dressed because we needed to talk. The guy started stammering some excuse about how this wasn't what it looked like, but I just held up my hand and walked out of the room. I went downstairs to my home office and started making phone calls. My wife and I had been married for 12 years, and I thought we had a solid relationship built on trust and mutual respect. We'd weathered financial struggles in the early years, supported each other through family deaths, and even survived a miscarriage that nearly tore us apart. She worked part-time at a local art gallery while I'd built up a successful consulting business that allowed us to live comfortably in a nice suburban neighborhood. We had joint accounts, shared investments, and a beautiful house that we'd renovated together over the years. What I discovered over the next few hours completely shattered everything I thought I knew about my marriage. While she was downstairs having what sounded like a heated argument with her lover, I went through our financial records with a fine-tooth comb. Credit card statements showed expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together, hotel charges during times when she claimed to be visiting her sister, and purchases at lingerie stores that never seemed to make it into our bedroom. The pattern went back almost 8 months, which meant this wasn't some spontaneous mistake but a calculated betrayal that had been going on for most of the year. The guy finally left around midnight, and my wife came into the office where I was still going through paperwork. She tried to explain that it was just a meaningless fling, that she was going through some kind of midlife crisis, and that she wanted to work things out. But I could see in her eyes that she wasn't really sorry about the affair itself, just sorry that she'd gotten caught. She kept emphasizing how much our life together meant to her, how we could go to counseling, how she'd do anything to make it right. I told her I needed time to think and that she should stay at her sister's place for a while. She packed a bag and left the next morning, but not before I overheard her on the phone with someone, probably her lover, talking about how she just needed to manage the situation for a few weeks until things calmed down. That's when I realized she had no intention of actually ending the affair or making any real changes to her behavior. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations and private investigator meetings. I hired someone to document her ongoing relationship with this guy, and what they found was even worse than I'd imagined. His name was something pretentious, and he came from old money but had never held a real job in his life. He'd been divorced twice already, both times taking significant settlements from wealthy women who'd been foolish enough to marry him. He drove a luxury car that was probably worth more than most people's houses, and lived in a downtown penthouse that his family trust fund paid for. The investigator also discovered that my wife had been telling this guy elaborate lies about our financial situation. She'd convinced him that I was much wealthier than I actually was, claiming that my business was worth millions and that we owned multiple properties. She'd even shown him fake documents that made it look like I had significant investments in various companies. The guy was clearly attracted to what he thought was a wealthy woman who would soon be available for marriage after a presumably expensive divorce. What made it even more infuriating was that my wife had been using our joint credit cards to buy expensive gifts for this guy, including a watch that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She'd also been giving him cash from our household account, telling him it was just spending money while claiming to me that she needed extra funds for art supplies and gallery expenses. The financial betrayal almost hurt more than the emotional one, because it showed how little respect she had for everything we'd built together. During this investigation period, my wife kept calling and texting, alternating between apologetic messages and angry demands that I stop being unreasonable. She'd show up at the house uninvited, sometimes bringing flowers or cooking elaborate meals like she could somehow win me back through domestic gestures. But I could tell from her behavior that she was still seeing the guy, probably telling him that she was working on getting a favorable divorce settlement that would set them both up for life. The breakthrough came when the investigator showed me photos of my wife and her lover looking at expensive real estate listings together. They were apparently planning to buy a house together, using what they assumed would be my money from the divorce settlement. The guy had even been bragging to his friends about landing a rich widow who would be free to marry him once her husband was out of the picture. The level of presumption and entitlement was absolutely staggering. That's when I decided to set my plan in motion. Instead of immediately filing for divorce, I started feeding my wife carefully crafted information about my business and finances. I told her that I'd received a major contract that would be worth several $1 million over the next few years, and that I was considering selling my business to a larger company for an enormous sum. I even created fake documents and emails to support these claims, making sure she'd have plenty of impressive-sounding information to share with her lover. At the same time, I was quietly transferring our joint assets into accounts that only I controlled, being careful to follow all legal requirements and document everything properly. I consulted with multiple attorneys to make sure I was handling everything correctly and wouldn't face any legal consequences for protecting my own interests. The goal was to make it appear as though our wealth was growing dramatically while actually securing what we already had. My wife completely bought into the story and started treating me with renewed interest and affection. She'd come by the house more often, bringing my favorite foods and talking about how excited she was about our future together. But I could tell from the way she was acting that she was already planning how to spend the money she thought she was going to get in the divorce. She'd casually mention expensive trips she wanted to take or luxury items she'd seen in stores, always framing it as things we could do together, but clearly thinking about doing them with someone else. The investigator continued monitoring her relationship with the guy, and it was clear that they were both getting more confident about their future together. He'd started looking at engagement rings and had even put a deposit on a yacht that he planned to buy once my wife's divorce was finalized. They'd also started planning an elaborate wedding that would cost more than most people's annual salaries, complete with a destination location and guest list that read like a who's who of the local social scene. After about 2 months of this elaborate deception, I finally made my move. I filed for divorce, but not in the way either of them expected. Instead of the lengthy, contentious process they were anticipating, I filed for a no-fault divorce with a very straightforward settlement agreement. Since I'd already secured our assets and documented all of her financial betrayals, I was able to offer her a minimal settlement that was actually quite generous given her behavior, but nowhere near what she'd been expecting. The papers were served to her at the art gallery where she worked, in front of her colleagues and customers. The settlement offer was for exactly half of our actual assets, which was much less than what she'd been telling her lover we were worth. There was no mention of the millions she'd been claiming I was about to receive, no reference to multiple properties or major business deals. Just a straightforward division of our actual, much more modest wealth. The look on her face when she called me after reading the papers was something I'll never forget. She went from confused to angry to desperate in the span of about 5 minutes, demanding to know what had happened to all the money she'd been talking about. I calmly explained that there had never been any major contract or business sale, that I'd simply been protecting our actual assets from her ongoing theft and deception. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. What happened next was even better than I'd hoped. My wife immediately called her lover to break the news, and according to the investigator, his reaction was explosive. He'd been counting on a wealthy widow with millions in assets, not a middle-aged divorced woman with a modest settlement and a track record of infidelity. The engagement ring went back to the store, the yacht deposit was forfeited, and the wedding plans were canceled within a matter of days. The guy completely ghosted my wife after that, blocking her phone number and refusing to see her. She tried showing up at his penthouse, but the doorman had been instructed not to let her in. She even went to some of the restaurants and bars where they used to meet, hoping to run into him, but he'd apparently warned the staff not to seat her or pass along any messages. The rejection was swift and brutal, leaving her with neither the marriage she'd destroyed nor the relationship she'd thought was worth destroying it for. My wife spent the next few weeks trying to convince me to reconsider the divorce, claiming that she'd learned her lesson and wanted to rebuild our relationship. But it was clear that her primary motivation was financial rather than emotional. She kept asking about the business deals and contracts I'd mentioned, refusing to believe that they'd never existed. When I finally convinced her that there was no secret wealth to be divided, her attitude shifted back to anger and resentment. The divorce was finalized 3 months later, and my wife moved into a small apartment across town. She kept her job at the art gallery, but the hours were reduced and the pay was barely enough to cover her basic expenses. The lifestyle she'd been planning with her lover was completely out of reach, and she'd burned too many bridges to easily find someone else to support her. The last I heard, she was working a second job at a retail store to make ends meet. Meanwhile, I was able to keep the house and most of our assets, along with my business and professional reputation intact. The whole experience had been emotionally devastating, but I'd managed to come out of it without being financially destroyed or publicly humiliated. My friends and family were supportive once they learned what had really happened, and I was able to maintain most of my social connections and professional relationships. The aftermath was actually more satisfying than I'd expected. I ran into the guy at a coffee shop about 6 months later, and he looked absolutely miserable. His expensive clothes couldn't hide the fact that he'd gained weight and had bags under his eyes like he wasn't sleeping well. When he saw me, he actually tried to duck out of the shop, but I caught his eye and just smiled and waved. The look of shame and embarrassment on his face was worth all the effort I'd put into the whole operation. I also heard through mutual friends that my ex-wife had tried to contact several other men she dated before our marriage, apparently hoping to rekindle old relationships now that she was single again. But word had gotten around about what had happened, and none of them were interested in getting involved with someone who'd cheated on her husband and then been abandoned by her lover when the money didn't materialize. Her reputation in our social circle was essentially ruined. The whole experience taught me that revenge doesn't always have to be loud or dramatic to be effective. Sometimes the best approach is to simply let people's own greed and dishonesty destroy them. My ex-wife and her lover had created this elaborate fantasy about their future together based on lies and stolen money, and when reality finally caught up with them, they had no foundation to fall back on. They'd both invested so much in a deception that they forgot to build anything real or sustainable. Looking back, I think the most satisfying part wasn't the financial protection, or even the poetic justice of their relationship falling apart. It was the fact that I'd maintained my integrity throughout the whole process, while they'd revealed their true characters. I'd been honest with my attorney, followed all legal requirements, and treated everyone involved with more respect than they'd shown me. When it was all over, I could hold my head high knowing that I'd handled a terrible situation with dignity and intelligence. The months that followed were actually quite liberating. I sold the house and bought a smaller place in a different neighborhood, somewhere with no memories of my failed marriage. I threw myself into my work and discovered that I was actually more productive and creative without the stress of a dysfunctional relationship. I also reconnected with old friends and hobbies that I'd neglected during the marriage, finding that I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed being single and independent. I occasionally wonder what would have happened if I'd confronted them immediately that first night, if I'd let my anger take over and created a big dramatic scene. But I think the controlled approach was much more effective and ultimately more satisfying. They'd both learned that actions have consequences, and that building a relationship on lies and betrayal is never sustainable. The lesson was probably more valuable than any amount of shouting or confrontation could have been. The final twist came about a year later when I heard that my ex-wife had started dating another man, someone she'd met at her retail job. He was a decent guy from what I could tell, with a steady job and no apparent interest in her non-existent wealth. But according to mutual friends, she was already starting to show signs of the same behavior patterns, talking about how she deserved better and making comparisons to her previous lifestyle. I felt genuinely sorry for the guy and hoped he'd figure it out before she could do too much damage. As for me, I'm doing better than I ever expected. The whole experience was painful and traumatic, but it also showed me that I'm stronger and more resilient than I'd realized. I've started dating again, but I'm much more careful about red flags and much more protective of my independence. I've also learned to trust my instincts and not ignore warning signs just because I want a relationship to work. The betrayal hurt, but it also freed me from a marriage that was built on foundations that were much shakier than I'd realized. The business is thriving, my social life is active and fulfilling, and I've discovered interests and passions that I'd forgotten I had. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the push you needed to create a better life than you ever imagined was possible. My ex-wife and her lover taught me that lesson without meaning to, and for that, I'm almost grateful for everything that happened.